ByteDance sold TikTok for less than 3% of what the market said it was worth. Not because the company was failing, because it had no choice. This is the story of what happens when a government decides the price. In some moment of 2025, ByteDance was worth more than $500 billion. Not on any stock exchange. The company had never gone public. That number came from secondary markets, investors buying and selling private stakes at a pace that kept pushing the implied valuation higher. In November of that year, a single block of shares traded by a Chinese venture firm implied a valuation of $480 billion. Months later, General Atlantic was exploring the sale of its stake at a figure equivalent to $550 billion. The company had generated $33 billion in net profit in 2024. It was projecting $50 billion for 2025. In December 2025, it signed an agreement to sell its most valuable international asset for $14 billion. There was no bankruptcy, no fraud, no financial collapse. What existed was a law, a deadline, and a government with enough power to dictate the terms of a transaction that no free market would have produced. The decision that cost billions was not made in a single room. It accumulated across years, quietly, in hearings and extensions and negotiations that never quite resolved, until the price of delay became the price of the asset itself. ByteDance was founded in 2012 by Zhang Yiming, a software engineer from Fujian province who had spent time studying at Nankai University and working at Microsoft and early Chinese startups before building a news aggregation app called Toutiao. The architecture was simple in concept and extraordinarily complex in execution, a recommendation engine that learned user preferences faster than any competitor had managed. Within a few years, Toutiao was the dominant news feed in China. Zhang's team then applied the same engine to short-form video, first with a domestic product called Douyin, launched in 2016, and then with an international version, TikTok, that absorbed a rival app, Musical.ly, in 2018. The Musical.ly acquisition was, by any accounting, the move that placed ByteDance inside the American market at scale. Musical.ly had been built partly in Shanghai, partly in Santa Monica, and had accumulated around 60 million users, many of them American teenagers. ByteDance paid somewhere between $800 million and $1 billion for it. The merged product kept TikTok's name, inherited Musical.ly's user base, and applied ByteDance's recommendation infrastructure to the combined audience. The growth that followed was, by the standards of the previous decade of social media, without precedent. TikTok reached 1 billion monthly active users in 2021. By 2023, it had surpassed 100 million American users. By 2024, that number stood at more than 170 million. But embedded in that expansion was a structural condition that Zhang Yiming's engineers had not designed and could not engineer away. ByteDance was a Chinese company. TikTok was its product. And in Washington, that distinction had begun to matter in ways that would not be resolved by technical architecture alone. The concern, stated plainly, was this: China's national intelligence law, passed in 2017, obligates Chinese entities to cooperate with state intelligence work when requested. American officials, across two administrations, across party lines, argued that this created a legal vector through which the Chinese government could, in theory, compel ByteDance to hand over data on American users, or to manipulate the content Americans saw. ByteDance disputed this framing at every stage. The company pointed to Project Texas, a multi-billion-dollar initiative to route American user data exclusively through Oracle servers on American soil, overseen by American staff inside a structure called USDS, TikTok's U.S. Data Security Division. The argument was straightforward. If the data never touches Chinese infrastructure, the intelligence law cannot reach it. Whether the technical safeguards were sufficient to neutralize the legal risk was a question that lawyers, engineers, and lawmakers argued about for years without resolution. What is documented is that the argument was not primarily technical, it was geopolitical, and geopolitical problems do not resolve through server architecture. The first executive order came in August 2020, under Trump's first term, directing ByteDance to divest TikTok's U.S. operations within 90 days. Courts blocked it. The Biden administration reversed the order in 2021, then quietly resumed regulatory pressure through the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, known as CFIUS, which had been reviewing the musical Dudley acquisition since 2019. Those CFIUS negotiations ran for years. ByteDance proposed structural remedies, offered more extensive data controls, restructured governance. The committee did not formally conclude. What emerged instead was legislation. In April 2024, President Biden signed the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary-Controlled Applications Act. The law was attached to a foreign aid package and moved through Congress faster than almost any major tech regulation in recent American history. Its terms were specific. ByteDance had 9 months to complete a qualifying divestiture of TikTok's American operations, or the app would be banned from U.S. app stores and web hosting services. Qualifying divestiture was the operative phrase, and it carried more weight than most of the coverage acknowledged. The law did not simply require ByteDance to sell TikTok to a buyer. It required the elimination of any operational relationship between the divested entity and its Chinese parent. That meant the algorithm, the data flows, the content moderation infrastructure, the advertising systems, all of it had to be severed from ByteDance's control. Not licensed, not shared, severed. TikTok challenged the law in federal court on First Amendment grounds. The case moved rapidly. The Supreme Court heard arguments on January 10, 2025, and upheld the law unanimously on January 17, 2 days before the original enforcement deadline. The app went dark on January 18, not because the government enforced the ban. The Biden administration had declined to act on its final day in office, but because Apple and Google had removed TikTok from their stores, and because ByteDance itself suspended services, apparently uncertain about liability under the new law. The outage lasted less than 24 hours. Donald Trump, inaugurated on January 20th, signed an executive order halting enforcement for a further 75 days. He did so, he later said, because he wanted a deal. What followed was the negotiation. The shape of what emerged over the months between January and December 2025 was not a clean sale. It was something more complicated and, from ByteDance's perspective, considerably more expensive than a divestiture. The structure that ByteDance ultimately agreed to, signed in December 2025 and formally closed in January 2026, created a new American entity called TikTok USDS Joint Venture LLC. Oracle, the enterprise software company run by Larry Ellison, took a 15% stake. Private equity firm Silver Lake took 15%. Abu Dhabi-based investment firm MGX took 15%. Various other American and global investors, including Michael Dell's family office and growth equity firms including Susquehanna International Group and Alpha Wave Partners, held the remaining 30.1%. ByteDance retained 19.9%, just below the threshold that would have triggered the divestiture law's foreign adversary prohibition. The valuation placed on the U.S. entity was approximately $14 billion. That number requires context. Analysts covering the sector had placed TikTok's standalone value, accounting for its algorithm, its user base of more than 170 million Americans, and its advertising revenue trajectory, somewhere between $100 billion and $200 billion, depending on the methodology and whether the recommendation system was included. The gap between those estimates and the $14 billion figure agreed in the joint venture was not incidental. It was structural. The decision that cost billions was not a single error in a single room. It was the accumulated cost of years of unresolved political exposure, compressed into a transaction that had no time for price discovery and no leverage for the seller. ByteDance did not walk away from the table. It had no table to walk away from. The algorithm question was the one that dominated the internal negotiations and the public debate. TikTok's recommendation engine was, by most assessments, the company's most valuable single asset. It was the system that determined what each user saw, in what order, with what frequency, and its ability to hold attention longer than any competing platform had been demonstrated at scale across 170 million American accounts. Without it, TikTok was a video hosting service. With it, TikTok was something closer to a behavioral operating system for the American attention economy. The law required no operational relationship between the new U.S. entity and ByteDance, but the algorithm existed inside ByteDance's global code base, maintained by engineers in Beijing and Singapore. Separating it completely would have taken years of engineering work and would have produced, at least initially, a substantially degraded product. What the deal arrived at was a compromise with significant ambiguity. The algorithm would be licensed by ByteDance to the new American joint venture. American engineers, working inside Oracle's infrastructure, would then retrain it using only U.S. user data. The underlying source code, the original model, remained ByteDance's intellectual property. The Public Integrity Project, a public interest law firm, filed suit against the Trump administration in March 2026, arguing that this arrangement preserved precisely the operational relationship the law was designed to eliminate. ByteDance still had a seat on the joint venture's board through Shou Chu, the global TikTok CEO. ByteDance still operated global interoperability, advertising systems, and e-commerce functions that touched the American product. The suit argued these were not technical distinctions but the core of what Congress had required to be severed. The legal challenge was still unresolved as of late March 2026. Whether the deal ultimately survived judicial scrutiny was a question the transaction's architects had known they were leaving open. What had driven ByteDance to accept this structure, a $14 billion valuation on an asset many analysts believed was worth 10 to 15 times more, was not financial distress. The broader company was, by any documented measure, financially healthy. It was generating profits at a scale few private companies had ever achieved. It was not insolvent. It was not in default. It had not missed debt payments. The pressure was sovereign, not financial. And that distinction matters when understanding the decision that cost billions. The U.S. law created a binary outcome: divestiture on Washington's terms, or a ban that would remove TikTok from American app stores and gradually degrade the product until it was effectively inoperable in the world's largest advertising market. The ban would not bankrupt ByteDance. Douyin and its other Chinese and international businesses would continue, but it would eliminate TikTok's American revenue base, which had been growing toward $23 billion in annual advertising income, and would signal to every other market that the app was politically toxic. The negotiation, then, was not between a willing seller and a willing buyer. It was between a company that had constructed something genuinely valuable inside a regulatory environment that had decided the ownership structure was incompatible with national security, and a U.S. government that had, through years of delay and multiple enforcement extensions, created so much uncertainty that the eventual price reflected distress, without any of the conventional indicators of financial distress. The decision that cost billions was not made in December 2025 when ByteDance signed the binding agreement. It was made years earlier, at every point where the company chose to continue operating in the United States, without resolving the structural question of its ownership. Each extension, each negotiation round, each congressional hearing that ended without a clear framework, had narrowed the eventual outcome. The geopolitical dimensions of the transaction were not a backdrop. They were the mechanism. ByteDance's situation illustrated, with unusual clarity, the risk calculus that any technology company faces when it operates at scale, across jurisdictions that regard each other as strategic competitors. The company had built its international business, and TikTok specifically, in a period when U.S.-China commercial relations, while strained, had not yet produced the kind of legislative action that would treat ownership itself as a national security threat. The national security law architecture in China and the CFIUS review process in the United States created a bilateral condition that no corporate structure could fully neutralize. ByteDance's Project Texas was a genuine and expensive attempt to address the technical dimensions of the concern. What it could not address was the legal dimension, that a Chinese law imposed obligations on Chinese entities regardless of where their servers were located. CFIUS had been aware of this tension since at least 2019, when it opened its review of the musical.ly acquisition. The 5 years between that review's opening and the signing of the Protecting Americans Act represented a period during which the structural problem was visible to regulators, visible to the company, and effectively unresolvable within the existing ownership framework. ByteDance could not cease to be a Chinese company. TikTok could not cease to be ByteDance's product. And the U.S. government could not, under the legal framework it operated within, be satisfied with a technical solution to what it had defined as a legal problem. The expropriation analogy is imperfect but instructive. ByteDance was not nationalized. Its assets were not seized. But the regulatory environment had created conditions under which the company was compelled to sell a minority-controlled interest in its most valuable international asset, at a price that bore little relationship to market value, on a timeline determined by legislative deadline rather than commercial readiness, to a buyer consortium partially shaped by the political preferences of the administration that controlled enforcement. That is a form of sovereignty over private assets that does not require the vocabulary of expropriation to be understood as such. The power imbalance between ByteDance and the U.S. government was not a surprise. It was a structural feature of operating a platform used by 170 million citizens of a country that had defined your parent company as a national security concern. The consortium that acquired 80.1% of the U.S. entity was not assembled through a competitive auction in the conventional sense. Oracle's involvement reflected both commercial logic. It was already the designated cloud infrastructure provider under Project Texas, and political proximity. Larry Ellison had been a supporter of Donald Trump and had attended meetings at Mar-a-Lago during the negotiation period. Silver Lake was one of the largest private equity firms in the world, with extensive experience in technology transactions. MGX, the Abu Dhabi investment vehicle, represented sovereign capital from a U.S.-aligned Gulf state. The combination of American tech infrastructure, major private equity, and friendly sovereign wealth was not incidental. It reflected what the U.S. government considered an acceptable ownership map. Reports emerged in March 2026 that the buyer consortium had agreed to pay the Trump administration a $10 billion transaction fee for facilitating the deal, a figure that attracted scrutiny from lawmakers and became part of the legal challenge filed by the Public Integrity Project. The administration valued the deal at $14 billion. Whether a $10 billion facilitation payment on a $14 billion transaction accurately reflected market dynamics was a question that congressional investigators had begun examining. ByteDance's 19.9% stake in the new entity meant it retained a financial interest in the U.S. business's future performance. It also retained, through algorithm licensing, a revenue stream tied to the joint venture's commercial success. How significant that licensing revenue would prove to be depended on how the retrained algorithm performed for American users, and on whether the legal challenges to the deal's structure would eventually force a renegotiation. The immediate aftermath of the January 2026 closing produced, for most of TikTok's American users, almost no visible change. The app continued to operate. The interface was unchanged. The content kept coming. Creators continued posting. Advertisers continued buying. For the 170 million Americans who used the platform, the ownership restructuring was an administrative event, not an experiential one. The algorithm was the variable most worth watching. The joint venture had committed to retraining ByteDance's recommendation engine using only American user data, without continuing to draw from the global behavioral dataset that had informed the original model. The retrained system would, in theory, make recommendations based solely on what American users watched, shared, and engaged with, without the signal enrichment that came from billions of interactions across TikTok's global footprint. Whether American users would notice the difference was not immediately clear. The algorithm's performance depended on the density and quality of the data it could access, and an American-only dataset of 170 million active users was not thin. But the separation from the global model was an irreversible constraint, and its long-term effect on the platform's engagement metrics, the core driver of its advertising value, remained an open variable in early 2026. For ByteDance, the transaction had cost something that balance sheets do not fully capture. The company had built TikTok's international business on the premise that a unified global recommendation system was its competitive advantage. The deal had not eliminated ByteDance from the American market, but it had placed the American market inside a structure that ByteDance did not control, governed by rules it had not written, with an algorithm it could no longer update directly. The financial interest was preserved at 19.9%. The strategic control was not. The broader question the transaction raised, which regulators in other jurisdictions were already studying in early 2026, was whether the U.S. approach would serve as a template. The Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary-Controlled Applications Act was jurisdiction-specific and China-specific in its legal framing. But the logic it embedded, that foreign ownership of a widely used platform creates a national security vector that technical safeguards cannot neutralize, was not limited in principle to Chinese companies or American users. European regulators had been examining similar questions under different frameworks, including the Digital Services Act and existing foreign investment screening mechanisms. India had already banned TikTok outright in 2020, citing sovereignty over its data environment. Other markets with strategic concerns about platform ownership were watching the American resolution closely. For technology companies with global ambitions, the ByteDance TikTok case had produced a precedent, though not a legal one, that was arguably more consequential than any court ruling. That a country with sufficient market leverage could compel a structural divestiture of a profitable, legally operating business on the grounds of its parent company's nationality, and could do so on terms that reflected regulatory pressure rather than market value. ByteDance had not committed accounting fraud. It had not violated antitrust law in the conventional sense. It had not misled investors or failed regulators on technical compliance. What it had done was build something that 170 million Americans used every day, inside a geopolitical framework that had not yet determined how to classify such a thing. The joint venture was legally closed. The app was running. The algorithm was being retrained. The lawsuit was pending in the D.C. Circuit. Shou Chu, TikTok's global CEO, held a seat on the new board. Zhang Yiming, ByteDance's founder, who had stepped back from day-to-day operations in 2021, held his stake in a company that had sold a fraction of its most visible international asset for a fraction of what that asset might have commanded in a different negotiating environment. The records of the CFIUS negotiations from 2019 through 2024 had not been made public. The internal communications from the months between the Supreme Court ruling in January 2025 and the signing of the binding agreement in December 2025 had not been made public. The precise terms of the algorithm licensing arrangement were not disclosed. The facilitation fee, if it existed as reported, had not been confirmed in detail. What remained in the public record was the structure of the outcome. A company with a $500 billion private market valuation had agreed to a $14 billion transaction for its most significant international property, under a law with criminal penalties for non-compliance, on a timeline set by legislative deadline, with a buyer consortium that had the endorsement of the enforcing administration. The decision that cost billions was made across many rooms over many years. No single moment, no single signature carries the full weight of it. The cost accumulated quietly. In every year that the structural question went unresolved, in every negotiation round that produced another extension rather than a framework, in every congressional hearing that generated pressure without generating clarity. The filings exist. The hearings are on record. The deal is closed. What happens to the algorithm, the real asset at the center of everything, is a question that no document signed in January 2026 has definitively answered.